was funny. I got myself all the way over there, and then I realized we needed to do an offertory. Yeah. It's embarrassing. It's kind of funny even to say this. Matthew 5:48 says, "Be perfect as your heavenly Father is perfect." I can't do this, even though it's going to be more painful at the end. I want you to spend a lot of time that we believe in the church for a long time that what Jesus meant by that, you know, the context of that is love your enemies and pray for those that persecute you. And he ends that whole chapter with, be perfect even as your heavenly Father is perfect. Isn't that unbelievable how we take a verse like that and we have made it into cultural norms that we have decided makes us perfect. This is how you know you're perfect. If you look this certain way, if you act this certain way, if you talk this certain way, if you have speech in this certain way, if you do this or you don't do that, or you know what I mean? You can't drink alcohol in the church, but we can drink a lot of coffee. Do you know what I mean? I grew up on coffee. Norwegian Christians in Minnesota, give me a break, man. They drink so much coffee. When I was 8 years old, we were drinking coffee. Do you know what I mean? My first European worship prayer service was like an eye-opening thing. I never drank, never grew up with alcohol. Alcohol was wrong. I grew up in a holiness church. You could only drink coffee when you were 8. You know what I mean? So I go to Europe and they're praying over people. They don't have water bottles. They have beer bottles while they're praying for people for healing. That was an eye-opening experience for me. But how does that work? You know what I mean? But what we often do is we define holiness based on whatever has crippled us that we've gotten free of. And that thing that you got free of, now everyone must be free of that thing that you were in bondage to. And then you too will be perfect, even as your heavenly Father is perfect. But Jesus doesn't make that the standard of perfection. He makes the standard of perfection, can you love your enemies? Can you pray for those that persecute you? Perfection's kind of a wild thing, you know? It's a tricky thing in music. Musicians always want to make everything perfect, and oftentimes what we'll find is that in our trying to make things perfect, we just make them worse, less real. A lot of times the world that we live in right now, you know what I mean? World music, it just keeps kicking Christian music's rear, because Christian music, first of all, we always follow about 5 paces behind the world and copy whatever the world's doing and then put Christian lyrics to it. But not only that, we also try so hard to make it perfect. We were recording in a jazz studio, in a studio where a guy that is an engineer does mostly jazz and classical records and some R&B records, and he's an engineer. And he had this guy. Has anybody ever heard of James Brown? Well, James Brown came in to record at his studio with his producers and his entourage. They were wearing really long black coats, let's just put it that way. And they stood outside, and the producer sits inside with the engineer. And James Brown, I didn't know this, he walks into a vocal booth. He walks into the vocal booth, and he's going to produce his new record with his new songs. He walks into the vocal booth, and he walks in there, and the engineer, this friend of ours, Glenn, he's there, and he's got his vocal mic up. No instrumentation around him. He let us hear this track. He says, "You guys got to hear this track. This is James Brown, new record that he's working on. Listen to this track." So we start listening to it, and he just sings in a vocal booth with no instrumentation. He doesn't play. When he's doing a track, this is how he does it. Ha! James Brown! That's the way that God made me. Wow! James Brown! That's what you hear on the track. That's the way that God made me. Biscuits and gravy. That's the way that God made me. And that's how he does it. So he walks into the producers, the little engineering area. Walks into the engineering area, and he says to, the producer sitting there, and Glenn's just the engineer, so he's just keeping his mouth closed. And he looks over at the producer. One take. I mean, he's all over the place. He's scatting all over the place, doing all kinds of crazy things. Walks in. The producer looks at him, and now the producer's got to take this vocal track and put music around it. Figure out how to make this a hit record. You know what I mean? And the producer, looks at James Brown and says, "James, that's great, man. Could you maybe do another take of that? Like one more take just to give us like something else to work with here?" And James looks at him and says, "Oh, man, first take is God. Everything else is man-made." So, I started thinking about that. I came home, I was telling my biological, what am I talking about? My brother-in-law. I didn't hardly sleep at all last night, so this is going to be interesting. And so my brother-in-law, I'm sitting with him, and my father-in-law comes in, and I'm telling him this story, and my brother-in-law says, "Jay, that's the way it is with you, man. Sometimes when I listen to your music, I listen to just the off-the-board tracks that I get back, and I love to listen to all your stuff, but the stuff I like the most is the stuff that's even the most raw. And whenever it seems like you're trying too hard, Jason, you bore me with your perfection." And then he said this, he goes, "I just get bored with the perfection of music out there, frankly. Because I'm just telling you as not a musician. I'm just a normal guy that does your website and hangs out. But he says, I'm just telling you my perspective. I'm not a musician, but when I listen to music, I get bored with Christian music. Not because of what they're saying. I just get bored with how they're doing it. They just try to be so perfect. I'm waiting for them to actually be human. Just waiting to hear them mess